design, create, communicate. I want that.
We've followed Gary's journey from managing Mark's destructive communication patterns through the difficult decision to let Mark go to rebuilding his team with intentional focus on inclusion and cultural intelligence. Gary now had a diverse, talented team with strong interpersonal skills and genuine commitment to collaborative work. He thought the hard part was over, and he was wrong. Gary discovered that even with a team of people who genuinely wanted to communicate well, business communication required deliberate structure and discipline. The informal communication that had sustained his team during the rebuilding phase was no longer sufficient for the complex business problems that they now face. Gary needed to help his team create effective business messages that could help influence decisions, coordinate action across the organization, and represent their work to stakeholders. This week follows Gary as he learned to apply systematic processes for creating business communications. His experience with Mark had taught him what not to do. His experience building an inclusive team had taught him to consider diverse perspectives. Now he needed to learn how to translate those lessons into effective written and structured business messages that his team could use to accomplish their goals. Gary's first major communication challenge with his new team came 6 months after the rebuild. They had successfully delivered a complex technical project and needed to present their recommendations for the next steps to senior leadership. Gary asked his team to draft a proposal. What he received was 8 pages of technical detail with no clear structure, no explicit recommendation, and no consideration for what these senior leaders needed to make their decisions. The team had worked collaboratively, incorporated diverse perspectives, and maintained psychological safety throughout the project, but they had not created an effective business message. Gary realized that effective messages emerge from consistent planning processes and a positive, other-oriented tone. His team had the tone right, but lacked the planning process. They knew how to communicate respectfully with each other, but didn't know how to structure communication for the business impact. These principles transfer to any type of communication. Gary recognized that the systematic approach to business messages that he needed to teach his team would improve their emails, presentations, reports, and even their verbal communications in the meetings. The discipline of planning, writing, and reviewing would make all of their communication more effective and, more importantly, influential. Gary reflected on his experience with Mark. Mark had been influential in the worst way possible. His communication had influenced people to avoid him, to root around him, to leave the organization. Gary wanted his new team to be influential in positive ways. He wanted their communication to influence decisions toward better outcomes, to build support for their recommendations, and to strengthen their professional relationships. That required learning to create effective business messages systematically. He first introduced his team to a 3-stage process for creating effective messages. Plan means getting the content right. Right means getting the delivery right. Review means double-checking everything. The framework seemed obvious when Gary first presented it, but he knew from experience that obvious frameworks were often ignored under time pressure. Making this process a habit requires discipline and scheduling. Gary had watched Mark skip planning sessions entirely, writing messages as streams of consciousness that reflected his immediate thoughts without considering audience needs or message structure. Gary had also watched himself and others on previous teams skip the review stage, sending messages that had errors in them, unclear statements, or unintended implications that damaged credibility. Gary implemented a team norm for important business communication. Before drafting any message that would go to stakeholders outside of the immediate team, the author had to complete a brief planning document. The document would not be sent with the message, but completing it forced the discipline around understanding audience needs and developing message structure before the writing even began. For messages going to senior leadership or external stakeholders, The author must first have at least one team member review the draft before sending it. The team initially resisted this process as bureaucratic overhead. They wanted to maintain their collaborative, flexible culture they'd built, and Gary had to explain that process discipline and collaborative culture were not in opposition. Process discipline was what enabled their collaborative culture to produce the business impact. Without systematic processes for completing and creating the effective messages, their excellent teamwork would remain invisible to the rest of the organization. He acknowledged that business writers tend to move back and forth between stages. The planning, writing, and reviewing stages were not strictly linear. As you draft a message, you might discover gaps in your planning that require going back to gather more information. As you review a message, you might realize that your primary message needs to be reframed, which requires returning to planning before revising the draft. Expert writers are more likely to analyze the needs of the audience, generate the best ideas to tackle a problem, and identify the primary message and key points before starting a formal draft. Gary recognized this pattern in his own experience. When he took the time to plan thoroughly before drafting, his messages were clearer and required less revision. When he jumped directly into drafting, he often had to completely restructure messages after writing several paragraphs.
I remember a specific incident with Mark that really drove this point home for me. Mark sent a 15-paragraph email to a client explaining why their requested feature was technically problematic. It was pure stream of consciousness, just Mark dumping everything he was thinking onto the page with no structure. The client was completely confused and frustrated, and I had to step in to repair the relationship. When I sat down to draft my own message to that client, I forced myself to spend 20 minutes just planning before I wrote a single word. I asked myself what the client actually needed to know, what decision they needed to make, and what information would help them make that decision confidently. My final message was 3 paragraphs. It gave them clear options with pros and cons for each, and it included a specific recommendation with my rationale. The client responded positively within an hour, and we moved forward. That experience taught me something crucial. Those 20 minutes I spent planning were not wasted time. They saved hours of confusion, multiple rounds of clarification emails, and potential relationship damage. I want my team to learn this lesson without having to make the costly mistakes I watched Mark make over and over.
He broke down the 3 stages into specific goals his team should accomplish at each stage. In the planning stage, getting the content right meant understanding your audience, gathering the right information, and developing your message. In the writing stage, getting the delivery right meant setting the right tone, applying a clear and concise style, and focusing on the navigational design. In the review stage, double checking everything meant getting feedback, ensuring your message was fair, and proofreading carefully. This framework became Gary's teaching structure for the next several team meetings. He realized his team needed explicit instruction in each of these components. They were skilled at technical work and at collaborative team communication, but most had never been taught how to create effective business messages systematically. Foundation would influence a significant budget allocation and would affect multiple teams. Gary had his team work through the planning stage together before anyone drafted anything. They analyzed stakeholder needs, gathered relevant information, and developed their primary message and supporting points collaboratively. Only after completing the planning work did individuals draft sections of the message. They then came back together to review, provide feedback, and ensure the final message was clear, fair, and effective. The process took longer than if Gary had simply assigned someone to write a quick recommendation, but the result was much stronger message that successfully influenced the decision. More importantly, the exercise taught the team how to apply the planning, writing, and reviewing stages systematically. He emphasized that effective business communicators possess an uncanny ability to step into the shoes of their audience members. This was directly connected to the empathy and perspective-taking skills he had worked to develop through the building of an inclusive team. The same capacity to understand how team members from different cultures and backgrounds experience situations was essential for understanding how message recipients would respond. His team needed to think about their audience's needs, priorities, and values. They needed to envision how their readers would respond when getting the message in thought, feeling, and action. They needed to consider how the message would affect their working relationships. All of these considerations required the kind of other oriented thinking that Gary had been cultivating through his inclusion work. He used his experience with Mark as a counterexample. Mark had never considered audience needs when communicating. He wrote messages that made sense to him without considering whether they made sense to recipients. He used technical jargon without defining it, assumed context that recipients didn't have, and organized information according to his own logic rather than according to what would help recipients make their decisions or take action. The contrast between Mark's approach and what Gary now taught his team was stark. Where Mark had been self-oriented, Gary taught other-oriented communication. Where Mark had imposed his perspective, Gary taught stepping into the audience member's shoes. Where Mark had ignored how his messages affected relationships, Gary taught considering relationship impact as primary planning considerations. He taught his team that effective business communicators regularly take specific actions to tailor the messages to others. They identify the reader benefits and constraints, consider the reader values and priorities, estimate their own credibility, anticipate reactions, and consider secondary audiences. Each of these actions required disciplined thinking during the planning stage, but each significantly improved message effectiveness. Gary created a simple template that his team could use during the planning. The template included sections for each of these considerations. What benefits will the reader see in the message? What constraints might prevent them from acting as I hope? What values and priorities will influence how they receive the message? How much credibility do I have with this reader, and how should that affect my approach? How will they likely react emotionally and practically? Who else might see this message, and who should influence what I write? The team initially found the templates tedious. It felt like it was slowing them down, but before long, they used it for several messages and saw the results. They began to appreciate its value. Messages that had been planned using the template got better responses, created less confusion, and advanced their goals more effectively than messages written without systematic audience analysis. One team member pointed out that the template was essentially codifying the perspective taking and empathy practices they'd developed for inclusive team communication, and Gary agreed. The skills that they had built for understanding diverse team members were directly applicable to understanding the diverse messages for the audiences. The template simply made those informal practices into explicit planning discipline. So he told his team that for many messages, identifying the reader benefits and constraints was the single most important planning step. Your readers respond when provided with something they value. Your readers will often see value in your messages, but may not be able to respond as you hope because they don't have enough time, resources, or authority to make certain decisions. One of Gary's team members, Priya, was drafting a message requesting approval for the technical tool purchase. Her initial draft focused on the technical benefits of the tool and why the development team needed it. Gary asked her to reframe the message by identifying what benefits the finance director who would approve the purchase would see. The technical benefits that mattered to Priya were not the benefits that would matter to the decision maker. Priya revised her message to focus on how the tool would reduce project timelines, which would accelerate revenue realization. She included the cost-benefit analysis showing return on investment within six months roughly. She addressed the finance director's likely constraints by proposing a phased purchase that would spread the costs across 2 different budget cycles rather than requiring one large single expenditure. The revised message was approved immediately, while her original draft would likely have been questioned or, worse, denied. The difference was that Priya had identified reader benefits and constraints and structured her message around them rather than around what she wanted to say.
The difference between how my team approaches requests now versus how Mark did it could not be more stark. When Mark wanted something, he would explain why he wanted it from his technical perspective. He would get so frustrated when decision makers did not immediately agree with him. He saw their resistance as proof that they did not understand the technical issues. It never occurred to him that maybe he had failed to connect his request to what they actually cared about. I watched this happen over and over. Mark would write these detailed technical justifications for tools or approaches he wanted to implement, and he could not understand why people were not convinced. He thought he was making a strong case, but he was making a case that only made sense to other people who shared his technical priorities. My new team is learning something Mark never learned. You lead with reader benefits, not with your own preferences. That is not manipulation. That is effective communication that respects that different people have different priorities. Your job as a communicator is to help others see how your message serves their legitimate interests, not to force your priorities onto them. When Priya reframed her tool request around revenue acceleration instead of technical elegance, she was not being dishonest. She was being effective.
He helped his team understand the difference between values and priorities. Values are enduring benefits and ideals that individuals hold. Priorities are ranking or assigning importance to things such as projects, goals, and tasks. Both shape how the reader responds to messages, but they operate very differently. Understanding reader values helped Gary's team frame messages in ways that resonated with what the recipients fundamentally cared about. One senior stakeholder valued innovation and was interested in the messages about new approaches. Another stakeholder valued stability and risk management and needed to see that innovations were being implemented carefully with appropriate safeguards. The same project could be framed differently for these two stakeholders based on their values. Understanding reader priorities helped the team time their message appropriately and provide relevant context. When a stakeholder was focused on an urgent crisis, they were unlikely to give the attention to the messages about longer term strategic initiatives. Gary's team learned to consider what was currently consuming their readers' attention and either frame their messages in relation to those priorities or simply wait for better timing whenever possible. This attention to values and priorities was another application of the cultural intelligence and inclusion skills that the team had just developed. Just as they had learned how to understand how different cultural values shaped communication preferences, they now learned to understand how individual and organizational values shaped message reception. The same capacity for perspective taking applied in both contexts. He introduced the concept that readers would inevitably judge your recommendations, requests, and other messages based on their view of your credibility. If your credibility is low, you need to consider how to strengthen your message in ways to overcome your lack of credibility. This was a particular reality for Gary's team, and they needed to understand, particularly for the junior team members who had excellent technical skills but limited organizational visibility. He showed his own experience of credibility challenges. When he had first been promoted to management, his technical credibility with his team was high, but his credibility with senior leadership was unproven. He had to work deliberately to build that credibility through consistent delivery, through finding allies who would vouch for his work, and through demonstrating understanding of business concerns beyond just technical consideration. He also shared Mark's experiences as a counterexample. Mark actually had high technical credibility initially. People knew he was brilliant, but Mark's communication failures had destroyed his credibility over time. By the end, even when Mark's technical analysis was correct, people discounted it because they'd learned not to trust his judgment about what mattered or his ability to consider broader implications. Gary wanted his team to understand that credibility was built through consistent, effective communication over time. Every message was an opportunity to build or damage credibility. Messages that were well planned, clearly written, and appropriately toned, and demonstrably fair built credibility. Messages that were hastily drafted, self serving, or careless damaged that credibility. Gary took an opportunity to set up time to talk with senior leaders to build relationships and visibility. They could ask for higher responsibility projects that would demonstrate their capabilities. They could make sure they fit with the corporate culture in terms of professional dress and communication style. They could attend meetings to get to know colleagues across the organization or create professional blogs or presentations about niche areas where they had expertise. He remembered a conversation he had with Mark about credibility. Mark complained that senior leadership didn't value his technical insights. Gary had suggested that Mark work on his building the credibility by improving his communication style and by demonstrating understanding of business concerns beyond technical elegance. Mark's response had been that his technical expertise should be sufficient and that if leaders didn't recognize that, the problem was with them, not with him. This was a fundamental error in Mark's thinking. Credibility is not something you possess inherently. Credibility is something that others grant you based on their experience of your reliability, judgment, and consideration of their concerns. You can't demand credibility. You can only earn it through consistent demonstration that you understand and care about what matters to others.
I had a conversation with Mark about credibility that really stuck with me. He complained that senior leadership did not value his technical insights. I suggested he work on building credibility by improving his communication style and by showing he understood business concerns beyond just technical elegance. His response was something I will never forget. He said his technical expertise should be sufficient, and if leaders did not recognize that, the problem was with them, not with him. That was Mark's fundamental error right there. Credibility is not something you possess inherently. Credibility is something that others grant you based on their experience of your reliability, your judgment, and your consideration of their concerns. You cannot demand credibility. You can only earn it through consistent demonstration that you understand and care about what matters to others. I share this lesson with my team now, though I do not always tell them it came from my experience with Mark. The principle is what matters. Credibility is granted by others based on their needs and values, not claimed by you based on your self-assessment. That other-oriented approach to credibility is consistent with everything else we are learning about effective business communication.
Gary shared this lesson with his team not by telling Mark's story specifically, but by emphasizing that credibility is granted by others based on their needs and values, not claimed by you based on your self assessment. This other oriented approach to credibility was consistent with everything else that they were learning about effective business communication. He taught his team that in the planning stage, they should envision how others would respond to their message. They should imagine how the reader will think, feel, and act when they read it. They should think about what they want to achieve in terms of workplace relationships. This anticipation should shape both message content and message delivery. One team member, Shen, was drafting a message that would deliver disappointing news to a partner team. A project they were collaborating on was going to be delayed due to technical problems that Shen's team had discovered. Shen's initial draft focused on explaining the technical problems in detail. Gary asked him to anticipate the partner team's reaction in receiving that news. Shen realized that they would be frustrated and anxious because the delay would affect their own deliverables. They would want to know how long the delay would be, what was being done to resolve the problems, and most importantly, whether there were any partial deliverables that could proceed while the full project was delayed. Shen revised his message to address these anticipated concerns explicitly, providing specific timelines, information, and proposing interim solutions. The partner team's response to Shen's revised message was much more positive than it would have been with his original draft. They were still disappointed about the delay, but they felt that Shen's team had thought carefully about the impact and was working to minimize it. The relationship was maintained rather than damaged, and the teams were able to collaborate effectively on mitigation strategies. Gary taught his team to anticipate that individuals other than their primary recipient would also view their messages. They might distribute their message to additional individuals whom it may affect. Their primary recipient might forward their message or otherwise share the information with others. They should consider which secondary audiences will view their messages and modify them accordingly if necessary. This lesson became very concrete when one team member sent what she thought was a private message to Gary, making critical comments about another team's work. Gary forwarded the message to the senior leadership team as part of a larger discussion about project challenges without thinking about how the critical comments would appear out of context. The message damaged the relationship between the teams and created awkwardness that took weeks to repair. Gary took responsibility for the forwarding error, but he used it as a teaching moment about secondary audiences. Even messages that seem private might be shared. Even messages sent to trusted recipients might end up in contexts you didn't anticipate. The discipline of assuming your messages might reach secondary audiences helps you communicate more carefully and more fairly. Gary taught a simple rule. Never write anything in a business message that you would not be comfortable in having read by anyone in the organization. This doesn't mean you couldn't have difficult conversations or raise concerns. It meant you should frame those conversations and concerns in ways that were fair and professional, even if they reached unintended audiences. He helped his team understand that effective business messages required thorough information gathering. The components were identifying the business problems, analyzing the business problems, and clarifying objectives. These three activities were essential foundations for message planning. His team was comfortable with technical problem identification and analysis, but they were less experienced with framing problems in business teams. Gary worked with the team to translate technical challenges into business implications. A performance bottleneck was not just a technical problem, it was a business problem because it affected user experience, which affected customer satisfaction and retention. A security vulnerability was not just a technical risk, it was a business risk because it could result in data breaches that damaged reputation and created legal liability. Learning to frame the problems in a business term made Gary's team more effective communicators with non-technical stakeholders. Instead of talking about technical issues that stakeholders didn't understand, they talked about business outcomes that stakeholders cared deeply about. This translation skill became a core competency for the team. Gary also emphasized the importance of clarifying objectives before drafting the messages. What exactly did they want to accomplish? Were they seeking approval for a decision, providing information that would inform others about their decisions, building support for future initiatives? Different objectives require different message structures and emphasis. Gary taught his team that excellent business thinkers possess specific characteristics. They clearly and precisely identify and articulate key questions and problems. They gather information from a variety of sources. They make well-reasoned conclusions and solutions. They remain open to alternatives for approaching and reasoning about the business problem, demonstrating mental flexibility. These characteristics were very much aligned with the inclusive thinking that Gary had worked to develop with his team. The capacity to consider diverse perspectives, to remain open to alternatives, and to gather information from multiple sources were all part of inclusive team culture. Gary made this connection explicit, helping his team see that the thinking skills required for effective business communication were the same skills required for effective inclusive collaboration. One of Gary's goals was to help his team see themselves as business thinkers, not just as technical implementers. They had deep technical expertise, but they needed to develop their capacity to analyze business problems, generate creative solutions, and communicate recommendations effectively. This expansion of their professional identity from technical specialists to business contributors was essential for their career development and for the team's organizational impact. He continued teaching about excellent business thinkers. They hold opposing views, avoid either or thinking, avoid one way linear thinking, and are open to non conventional solutions. They increase their skills for communicating with others to figure out and solve complex problems. These characteristics required the kind of cognitive flexibility and collaborative problem solving that Gary's team had been developing. The connection to avoiding groupthink that Gary had taught during the team communication unit was clear. Excellent business thinking required the same capacity to consider multiple perspectives and to avoid premature convergence on a single solution. The discipline of gathering information from diverse sources and remaining open to alternatives was essential for both effective thinking and effective communication. Gary set up regular team problem solving sessions where they practiced these skills explicitly. They would take a complex business problem and deliberately generate multiple framings of the problem before settling on one. They would develop competing solutions and evaluate them fairly rather than immediately dismissing alternatives. They'd seek input from people with different expertise as well as perspectives rather than relying on only their technical expertise. These practices improved both their problem solving and their communication. When they drafted messages recommending solutions, they could explain what alternatives they had considered and why their recommendation was superior. This made their messages more credible, more persuasive, because readers could see that the team had thought rigorously about the problem. Gary taught his team to distinguish between facts, conclusions, and positions. Facts are statements that can be relied on with a fair amount of certainty and can be observed objectively. Conclusions are statements that are reasoned or deduced based on facts. Positions are stances you take based on sets of conclusions. The distinction was critical for clear business communication. Gary's team needed to be explicit about which statements in their messages were facts, which were conclusions based on those facts, and which were positions that they were advocating. Confusing these categories created unclear messages that readers couldn't evaluate properly.
Mark constantly confused facts, conclusions, and positions, and it made productive dialogue impossible. He would present his positions as if they were objective facts. He would say things like, "This architecture is objectively the best approach," when what he really meant was, "Based on these technical facts and my analysis of them, I conclude that this architecture is superior, and I am taking the position that we should implement it." When you present positions as facts, you make disagreement seem like denial of objective reality. That is what Mark did constantly. If someone disagreed with his architectural preferences, Mark treated them as if they were denying obvious technical truths. He could not understand that different people could look at the same facts and draw different conclusions, or that different conclusions could lead to different positions depending on what you prioritized. I want my team to be precise about facts, conclusions, and positions. When they state facts, they should be able to point to the evidence. When they draw conclusions, they should be clear about the reasoning that takes them from facts to conclusions. When they advocate for positions, they should acknowledge that their position reflects their priorities and that other positions might be reasonable for people with different priorities. This precision makes communication clearer and makes it possible for others to engage with their reasoning rather than just accepting or rejecting their positions wholesale.
Gary emphasized that asking yourself, now that I understand the problem, what exactly do I want to accomplish, will help you decide how hard to push certain positions and will help you balance your preferred work outcomes with your work relationships. This question connected message planning to the broader considerations of relationship managing and organizational effectiveness. His team sometimes struggled with this balance. They cared deeply about technical quality and wanted to advocate strongly for the approaches they believed were superior, but they also needed to maintain productive relationships with stakeholders who might have different priorities or constraints. Clarifying objectives helped them find that right level of advocacy for each situation. For messages where the stakes were truly high, where the wrong decision could create significant problems, The team learned to advocate strongly while still maintaining a respectful tone. For messages where they had preferences but could live with alternatives, they learned to present their recommendations more lightly and to express genuine openness to others' approaches. This calibration of advocacy intensity based on objectives and relationship importance made them more effective communicators. He also taught his team to consider long term relationship impacts in their objective setting. A single message might seem unimportant in isolation, but every message contributed to building or damaging workplace relationships over time. Sometimes it was worth not getting exactly what you wanted in a particular situation in order to preserve the relationships that would be more important for future collaboration. Gary taught his team the components of message development. Framing the primary messages meant identifying what simple, vivid statement of 15 words or fewer captured the essence of their message. Setting up the logic meant determining supporting points, explicit calls to action, and the order of the message logic. The 15-word limit for primary messages was challenging for Gary's technically minded team. They wanted to include caveats, qualifications, and technical nuance in their primary statements, but he had to help them understand that the primary message was not meant to capture all the complexity. It was meant to provide a clear, memorable core that readers could understand and remember even if they forgot the details. Gary used a simple test question. Will readers remember your primary message 2 hours from now, 2 days from now, or 2 weeks from now? If the primary message was too complex or too hedged with qualifications, readers aren't going to remember it. The supporting points could provide the necessary detail and nuance, but the primary message needed to be clear and memorable. One team member drafted a message with the primary message: we recommend adopting the microservices architecture with appropriate consideration of the operational complexity it introduces and with phased implementation to minimize risk. Gary asked what readers would remember about that statement 2 days from now. The team member acknowledged they probably would not remember much of, if anything at all. But Gary helped her refine that message to say, we recommend the microservices architecture with phased implementation. The supporting points could then explain the operational complexity, considerations, and of course the risk mitigation approaches. He emphasized that message development required framing the primary message effectively. The frame should be a vivid statement with rational and emotional appeal. The planning questions were crucial. Will readers remember the primary message 2 hours from now? Will this framework make the readers more likely to support my call to action? Gary taught his team that effective frames often combined rational appeal with values alignment. The rational appeal provided logical reasons to support the recommendation, and the values alignment showed how recommendation connected to things that the reader cared about deeply. Both dimensions were necessary for messages to be truly influential. One of Gary's team members, Patty, was proposing an investment in accessibility improvements for their product. Her initial primary message was we should improve accessibility compliance. This was accurate, but not compelling. Gary worked with her to reframe around both the rational appeal and the values alignment. Her revised primary message became accessible design expands our market and reflects our values. The rational approach was the market expansion. The values alignment was living up to organizational commitments to inclusion. The reframed message was much more effective because it gave readers both logical and emotional reasons to support the recommendation. The supporting points then provided details about specific accessibility improvements, market opportunity analysis, and implementation approach. But the primary message had already created the frame that made readers receptive to those details. He further taught his team about direct and indirect message approaches. Direct or deductive approaches begin by stating the primary message, lay out the supporting reasons, and conclude with a call to action. Indirect or inductive approaches provide supporting reasons followed by the primary message. The choice between direct and indirect approaches depended on the audience analysis. When readers were likely to be resistant or when the message involved bad news that needed careful framing, indirect approach always allowed you to build the understanding before delivering the primary message. His team tended to default to the indirect approaches because they felt more comfortable building their case before stating their conclusion. He helped them realize that for many business messages, particularly to busy senior leaders, the direct approach was more respectful to the reader's time. You state your recommendation clearly at the beginning, and the readers who trust you can act on it immediately. Readers who want to understand your reasoning can read the supporting points, but you have not forced everyone to wade through all of the reasoning before discovering what you're recommending. However, Gary also taught situations where the indirect approach was appropriate. When delivering disappointing news, when making requests that might be perceived as unreasonable, or when audiences were likely to reject direct statements of your position, indirect approach allowed you to prepare the ground for before stating what your message was. Gary reflected with his team on what they had learned about creating clear and effective messages. Effective business communication starts with planning around audience needs, purpose, and context. Strong messages balance clarity, logic, and tone to influence understanding, decisions, and action. Readability improves impact through concise language, natural style, and intentional design choices. Navigational design helps readers find, process, and remember key information efficiently. Reviewing messages using fair Reviewing messages using the FAIR test ensures accuracy, transparency, impact awareness, and respect. Over the months of working on business communication skills, Gary's team had transformed not just their writing, but their thinking. They approached business problems more systematically, considered audience perspectives more carefully, and communicated their recommendations more effectively. The discipline of planning, writing, and reviewing had become habitual rather than feeling like a burdensome overhead. Gary saw connections between all the lessons he had learned since Mark's experience. Mark's failure had been comprehensive. He had poor emotional intelligence, which damaged his interpersonal communication. He had no cultural intelligence or inclusion mindset, which limited his ability to work effectively with diverse colleagues. And he never had systematic approaches to creating effective business messages, which meant his technical insights never translated into organizational influence. Gary's team now had all three dimensions. They had developed emotional intelligence and strong interpersonal communication through Gary's team now had all three dimensions. They had developed emotional intelligence and strong interpersonal communication through their collaborative team culture. They had developed cultural intelligence and the inclusion practices through intentional learning and practice. And they had now developed systematic approaches to creating effective business messages. This combination made them not just technically capable, but organizationally effective.
18 months after firing Mark, Gary understood that removing one toxic person had never been the real solution. It had been the start of a larger transformation. Mark had represented an outdated model where technical brilliance excused communication failures. Gary's rebuilt team demonstrated what modern professional excellence required. Technical competence combined with emotional intelligence, inclusion practices, cultural awareness, and systematic business communication skills. These human competencies were not separate abilities, but interconnected dimensions of the same capacity. The ability to understand diverse perspectives, communicate across difference, and influence through well-crafted messages. Mark had failed at all of them. Gary's team had learned to integrate all of them. That integration was what separated isolated technical brilliance from genuine professional effectiveness.
Design, create, communicate. I want that.